Last fall, we did the Blueprint series, and I stood on this very property and nothing was behind me as we invited you to discover God's blueprint for your lives. And now we're standing with a building partially built behind us. And so this spring, we're going to tackle the idea of God's radical love for us and our radical love for our neighbors. And I don't know about you, but I'm really excited about this building. It's been fun to drive by and watch them build. And as we stand here now, we hear the equipment behind us. We hear men working and walls going up and electrical lines going in. And we're really excited about this building. And you know what? Our community will be as well for a little while. I've had people, I don't know about you, Ben, but I've had people that have been asking me about our building. But you know, when I went on my sabbatical 3 years ago, one of the things that a lot of people told me was that for about 6 months, the community will be interested. About 6 months after it's finished, the community will be interested in your building. After that, it's going to kind of be business as usual. They'll drive by it just like any other building, and it'll become just normal for them on their drive to work every day. So if we're going to see this building as our main tool for reaching our community for Christ, we're really going to be in trouble because it's not going to do that. Instead, we have to figure out a way to take the gospel to people who are increasingly marking none of the above on surveys for religion. You know, 23% of the people in America now mark that box. They say, I don't have any interest in religion at all. If you're under the age of 30, that percentage goes up to 36%. So our culture is becoming increasingly secular, less interested in what happens even in brand new buildings. So how are we going to reach them? Well, I think it's going to happen when we learn to love our neighbor. And that's what we're going to talk about in this series. Finding a way to take the gospel message, which has radically changed us, and helping them receive it and understand it in a way that makes sense to them. It's not going to be happening by this building. It's going to be happening when we begin to act like an Acts 2 church, where they learned the power of the gospel and were able to share that in deep community in a way that was attractive to their neighborhood. And I think Acts 2 is a real great model for us as we think about how to radically love our neighbors.
Absolutely. And Acts 2 to me is just the quintessential example of what authentic Christian community looks like. And you're going to be studying it with your group in a little bit, but before that I want to give just a little bit more context, because before we get to this place of this just incredible community, first we see earlier in the chapter, Pentecost happens, where the Holy Spirit descends on this group of people. And then the Apostle Peter gives this incredible sermon, just laying out the gospel and explaining who Christ was. And as a response, they just got into these groups and had this authentic community that was just based on gratitude for what Christ had done. And so you'll see as we read it, as your group meets, that they broke bread, they took communion together, they prayed, they worshiped, they served, they considered that none of their belongings were their own, so they just gave whatever they needed to fit needs of the community. And that's just inspiring, and I believe that that's imperative to establish that first before we get to this idea of what does it mean to love your neighbor, because we need to begin with that mindset of abundance that can only come from recognizing how much Christ has lavished on us. And because otherwise we're going to look a lot like the rest of the world does, that lives with the mindset of scarcity, of I don't have enough, I barely have enough for my family and for me, and so I'm just going to worry about that. I think two things could result, two less than ideal results could happen as we have a dialogue about this idea, this command from Christ. The first is you hear it and you say, that's awesome, that sounds great, I want to do that, but I just have no idea how to even begin to do that. And then eventually we just forget about it and move on. The second is saying, I don't have time for another activity. Maybe this is for someone who has a less busy schedule than me, but definitely not me, because my schedule is just maxed out. And honestly, I can relate to both of those things. I have a baby that's 8 months old, and my idea of what free time is has been radically redefined. So I cannot say I have a ton of free time, which is why I love this strategy that I found from a pastor named Dave Ferguson that I found when we were just praying and preparing for this sermon series. And he lays out 5 different ways to bless your neighbor. It's a simple acronym that spells out bless that we can do, any of us can do every single day, can do at least one of these to bless our neighbors. And so I'm just going to go through these super quick. We're going to have time to dig in deeper later on in the weeks ahead. But the first one is begin with prayer. This is something we can all do every day. It's not always getting on your knees and praying for 2 hours straight for the Johnsons next door. It can just be as you see your neighbor mowing their lawn, just lifting them up in prayer. As you drive by houses, just thinking of them. If you don't know their names, just pray that you will get to know their name and that you'll get to know them. And that leads into the next one, which is listen. Just listen to your neighbor, hear their story, get to know who they are, who their kids are, what their history is. The next is my personal favorite, which is eat.
Yeah, right.
I love to eat food. If you know me, you know that is a true statement. And this is so great because we all have to do it. We do it 3 times a day. And the idea behind this is just adding a gospel intentionality with some of those meals. Maybe it's just one time a week you invite a neighbor to share a meal with you. And that's where incredible ministry can happen. That's where those relationships can develop. And then the next one is to serve. And I'm sure many of you can see how these just build on top of one another. How once you're praying for your neighbor and you listen to your neighbor and you are sharing meals with your neighbor, that's when you can learn how to best serve your neighbor. Beyond just a superficial, I think that looks like their biggest need. Once I actually know them and have built that trust, I actually learn what their true needs are and can meet those. And then finally, the scariest one to me is story. It's sharing your story. And I'm sure this is way out of the comfort zone of a lot of people. But get the idea out of your head of knocking strangers' doors and handing out gospel tracts. This is not what we're talking about. This is a follow-up to these relationships that you developed. And just to get to the point where you can say, this is my story. This is how Christ has transformed me, my marriage, my life. And this is just so important to me. And this is why. And the Spirit will let you know when the time's right to be able to do that. So those are 5 ways that we're going to be talking about how we can bless our neighbor.
Yeah, I love that idea of abundance. And I really think that's where it all starts. Remembering how much we have been given. We talked about that in the Blueprint series. And tonight, to help you remember that abundance piece, you're gonna serve communion to one another in your groups. Your leaders have been instructed and equipped and encouraged to lead you in communion. This is something for believers to do to remind us of the abundance of the gospel, that we never have to want for love and encouragement. This all comes because of the gospel message. So you're going to practice communion together, and as a reminder of that abundance, because that's foundational to this whole series, as we talked about on Sunday. But we also want you to, so you'll do communion together, but we also want you to take that first next step in blessing your neighbor. And as Ben said, what a great strategy. We're gonna come back to this bless strategy, but we want to start tonight by beginning with prayer. And so we want you to pray for your neighbors in your groups, and maybe share first names of your neighbors, or if you don't know their names, just share something about them and go around your groups and begin praying for your neighbors. So you're going to start practicing that wonderful, simple little way of blessing your neighbor tonight in your group. So share communion together and begin to pray for your neighbor. And thank you for joining us tonight. So as our building continues to be built, let's remember, it's wonderful. This is where we're going to worship. This is where we're going to grow. But really where we're going to serve and really impact our community is not by trying to drag them here, but us going to them with this abundant gospel. So enjoy communion together and pray for your neighbor.